Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1892 brought with it frigid winds that whispered through the bare trees of the Vale estate, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Isadora Vale stood before the tall windows of her library, watching the morning mist rise from the abandoned gardens like phantoms dancing among the wild rose bushes. At 42 years of age, she had become the final guardian of a family empire that stretched across generations, yet now seemed as fragile as the spider webs that adorned the forgotten corners of the mansion. The Vale property extended across rolling acres of land, where once cultivated fields had fed not only the family but the entire surrounding region. The main mansion, an imposing three-story structure built from local limestone, dominated the landscape like a monument to the power and influence the Vales had wielded for decades. Its Gothic towers pierced the grey sky, while carved gargoyles silently observed the grounds that stretched as far as the eye could see. Isadora carried the burden of a complex inheritance. Her grandfather, Augustus Vale, had been a visionary who transformed barren land into a thriving agricultural empire, building not merely wealth, but a reputation for integrity that extended far beyond the boundaries of his property. Her father, Henry Vale, had continued the legacy, expanding the business to include a small railway that connected the estate to distant markets. But with each generation, secrets had accumulated like dust in the mansion's corridors, and Isadora felt the weight of these unrevealed mysteries pressing upon her shoulders. The mansion itself was a labyrinth of architectural contradictions, hallways that seemed to lead nowhere, staircases that ended abruptly at solid walls, and doors that had remained locked for so long that their keys had been lost to the mists of time. The building's original blueprints, if they had ever existed, were nowhere to be found among the family's extensive records. Rooms appeared to have been added without consideration for the overall design, creating a structure that defied logical navigation even for those who had lived within its walls for decades. Recent discoveries had begun to unsettle Isadora's understanding of her ancestral home. While organizing her father's papers following his death the previous spring, she had uncovered correspondence that hinted at construction projects that had never been documented in the family's official records. References to foundation work and lower chambers appeared repeatedly in letters between her father and various contractors, yet no such spaces existed in any part of the mansion she had ever explored. The estate's staff, many of whom had served the family for generations, spoke in hushed tones about sounds that emanated from beneath the mansion's floors during the quiet hours of night. Footsteps where no feet should tread, voices that carried no words, and the occasional sound of what could only be described as construction work continuing in spaces that should have been empty earth and stone. These reports had initially been dismissed as the natural settling of an old building, but their persistence and consistency had begun to create an atmosphere of unease that permeated the household. Isadora's own experiences had grown increasingly difficult to rationalize. Cold drafts emerged from solid walls, carrying scents that belonged to no part of the mansion she knew. The floorboards in certain areas of the house exhibited a hollow quality when walked upon, suggesting empty spaces beneath that should not exist according to any logical understanding of the building's construction. Most disturbing were the nights when she would wake to the sound of movement directly below her bedroom, as if someone were walking through rooms that simply could not be there. The family's financial records, meticulously maintained across 3 generations, revealed expenditures that seemed excessive for the documented construction and maintenance of the estate. Large sums had been paid to contractors and laborers for work that left no visible evidence of completion. Materials had been purchased in quantities that far exceeded what would have been necessary for any known projects. These discrepancies painted a picture of hidden construction that had consumed significant resources while leaving no trace of its purpose or extent. As winter approached, Isadora found herself drawn repeatedly to the mansion's foundation walls, searching for any indication of the secrets that seemed to lie beneath her feet. The limestone blocks that formed the building's base appeared solid and undisturbed, yet the evidence suggested that somewhere beneath the structure lay spaces that had been deliberately concealed from the knowledge of future generations. The mystery of what her ancestors had built and why they had chosen to hide it so thoroughly had become an obsession that dominated her waking thoughts and haunted her dreams. The discovery came on a particularly dreary November morning when Isadora decided to venture into the mansion's oldest wing, a section that had been sealed off since her childhood due to what her father had described as structural concerns. Armed with an oil lamp and a ring of ancient keys she had found among her grandfather's effects, she made her way through corridors that had not felt human presence for decades. The air hung thick with the mustiness of abandonment, and her footsteps echoed hollowly against walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect sound. Behind a door marked only with faded Roman numerals, Isadora uncovered what appeared to have been her great-grandfather's private study. Unlike the rest of the mansion, this room had been preserved in a state of suspended animation, as if its occupant had simply stepped away and never returned. Dust sheets covered furniture that maintained their original forms beneath the protective fabric, and books lined the walls in perfect order, their leather bindings still supple despite the passage of time. The desk that dominated the center of the room held the first concrete evidence of the mysteries that had been plaguing Isadora's thoughts. Rolled architectural drawings lay scattered across its surface, held down by paperweights that had prevented them from curling despite the years of neglect. These were not the plans for the mansion as she knew it, but rather detailed schematics for an entirely different structure that seemed to exist beneath the one she had called home her entire life. The drawings revealed a complex network of chambers, corridors, and rooms that extended deep into the earth beneath the mansion's foundation. The architectural style was distinctly different from the Gothic revival elements that characterized the visible portions of the estate, suggesting a much older design philosophy that predated the mansion's known construction period. Measurements and annotations covered every inch of the blueprints, written in a precise hand that belonged to someone with extensive knowledge of engineering and construction techniques. Among the papers, Isadora found a leather-bound journal that bore the initials EM embossed in gold upon its cover. The entries within, written in the same careful script as the architectural annotations, documented a construction project that had begun in 1823 and continued for nearly 15 years. The author, who identified himself as Edmund Mortimer, described himself as the chief architect for what he termed the Vale Foundation project, a massive undertaking that had required the coordination of dozens of workers and the importation of specialized materials from quarries hundreds of miles away. Mortimer's entries painted a picture of a construction effort that had been conducted with extraordinary secrecy. Workers had been brought in from distant regions to prevent local knowledge of the project's scope and purpose. Materials had been delivered under cover of darkness, and completed sections of the underground structure had been sealed immediately upon completion to prevent unauthorized access. The architect wrote of chambers designed for purposes that were never explicitly stated, but which required specific atmospheric conditions and structural reinforcements that suggested they were intended to house something of considerable importance. The journal's most revealing entries concerned the relationship between the underground structure and the mansion that would eventually be built above it. Mortimer described a complex system of hidden access points, concealed staircases, and movable wall sections that would allow passage between the two levels while maintaining the illusion that only the surface structure existed. The architect had taken extraordinary care to ensure that the weight distribution of the upper mansion would not compromise the integrity of the chambers below, requiring innovative engineering solutions that pushed the boundaries of contemporary construction techniques. As the project neared completion, Mortimer's entries began to reflect a growing unease about the purpose of his creation. References appeared to preparations for the preservation and accommodations for the extended residence of the family legacy. The architect wrote of rooms designed with no windows, ventilation systems that drew air from deep underground sources, and storage areas that seemed intended to sustain human habitation for extended periods. His final entries expressed concern about the ethical implications of his work and his growing suspicion that he had been instrumental in creating something that defied conventional understanding. The journal's last entry, dated December 15th, 1837, was written in a noticeably different hand, suggesting that Mortimer's health had deteriorated significantly. He wrote of his intention to seal the access points to the underground structure and to destroy all records of its existence, expressing hope that future generations would never have cause to discover what lay beneath their feet. The architect's final words spoke of his regret at having created a monument to human ambition that should remain forever hidden from the light of day. Accompanying the journal, Isadora found detailed maps that showed the precise locations of the hidden access points throughout the mansion. These entrances had been disguised as decorative elements, built into the mansion's walls and floors with such skill that they appeared to be nothing more than architectural flourishes. The maps indicated that the primary entrance lay behind the massive fireplace in the mansion's great hall, accessible through a mechanism that required specific knowledge of its operation to reveal the passage beyond. The Great Hall of the Vale Mansion had always been the crown jewel of the estate's public spaces, a cathedral-like chamber that rose 2 full stories and featured a fireplace so massive that a grown man could stand upright within its hearth. The mantelpiece, carved from a single block of black marble imported from quarries in Vermont, depicted scenes of pastoral life that had seemed merely decorative to generations of the Vale family. Now, armed with Mortimer's detailed maps, Isadora examined these carvings with new understanding, recognizing them as more than artistic embellishment. According to the architect's notes, the mechanism that would reveal the hidden passage required the manipulation of specific elements within the carved scenes. The process was described as a sequence of precise movements that would activate a counterweight system concealed within the mansion's walls. Mortimer had designed the mechanism to be virtually undetectable to casual observation, while remaining functional for those who possessed knowledge of its operation. Isadora spent hours studying the carvings, comparing them to the detailed diagrams in Mortimer's journal. The scenes depicted shepherds tending their flocks, farmers harvesting grain, and children playing beneath ancient oak trees. Each figure had been carved with meticulous attention to detail, but certain elements stood out as slightly different from the others. A shepherd's staff that protruded further from the marble surface, a child's hand positioned at an unusual angle, and a tree branch that seemed to invite manipulation rather than mere observation. The first element to be activated, according to the instructions, was located in the upper left corner of the mantelpiece, where a carved oak tree spread its branches across the marble surface. One particular branch, barely distinguishable from the others, except for its slightly different angle, was designed to rotate when pressure was applied in a specific manner. Isadora found that by pressing the branch upward while simultaneously turning it clockwise, she could feel the mechanism engaging within the wall behind the fireplace. The second step required manipulation of a shepherd's staff located in the central portion of the carving. The staff, which appeared to be a solid part of the marble, actually concealed a sliding mechanism that could be pushed inward when the correct pressure was applied. The movement was subtle, requiring only a few millimeters of displacement, but Isadora could hear the faint sound of gears turning somewhere within the mansion's structure as the mechanism responded to her touch. The final element was perhaps the most ingenious of Mortimer's designs. A carved child, positioned in the lower right corner of the mantelpiece, held what appeared to be a simple flower in its outstretched hand. The flower, however, was designed to be twisted counterclockwise, causing it to sink into the marble surface and disappear entirely. This action completed the sequence and triggered the primary mechanism that would reveal the passage beyond. As the final element clicked into place, Isadora heard the deep rumbling of machinery that had remained dormant for decades. The sound seemed to emanate from deep within the mansion's walls, suggesting a system of considerable complexity and scale. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the massive fireplace began to rotate on a central axis, revealing that what had appeared to be a solid stone structure was actually a carefully balanced door of enormous proportions. Behind the fireplace lay a chamber that Mortimer's plans had designated as the primary access point to the underground structure. The space was roughly circular, with walls constructed from the same limestone as the mansion's foundation, but finished with a level of craftsmanship that exceeded even the main building's interior. Gas fixtures, long since disconnected from any source of fuel, lined the walls at regular intervals, suggesting that the chamber had once been illuminated by artificial light. A spiral staircase descended from the center of the chamber, its iron railings wrought with the same attention to detail that characterized the mansion's visible architecture. The steps themselves were carved from granite and showed signs of wear that indicated they had been used regularly during the period of their construction. The staircase descended into darkness that seemed to swallow the light from Isadora's lamp, suggesting a depth that extended far beyond what would be necessary for a simple basement or storage area. The walls of the access chamber bore inscriptions that had been carved directly into the stone, written in the same precise hand that had authored Mortimer's journal. These messages appeared to be instructions for future generations, explaining the proper operation of various systems and mechanisms that controlled different aspects of the underground structure. References to ventilation controls, water management systems, and what were described as preservation protocols suggested that the hidden chambers had been designed to function as a completely self-contained environment. Most intriguing were the inscriptions that spoke of the family's eternal residence and preparations for the continuation of the Vale legacy beyond the constraints of conventional existence. These phrases, carved with the same care as the technical instructions, hinted at purposes that transcended simple storage or even emergency shelter. The language suggested that the underground structure had been conceived as something far more permanent and comprehensive than any conventional basement or foundation space. As Isadora prepared to descend the spiral staircase, she noticed that the air flowing up from the depths below carried scents that seemed impossible given the structure's age and supposed abandonment. Fresh air moved through the passage, suggesting that the ventilation systems described in Mortimer's inscriptions remained functional despite decades of neglect. The descent into the underground structure revealed an architectural marvel that defied every assumption Isadora had held about her family's estate. The spiral staircase continued for what felt like an eternity, each step taking her deeper into a realm that existed in complete contradiction to the natural world above. The walls gradually transitioned from rough-hewn limestone to smooth, polished surfaces that reflected her lamplight with an almost mirror-like quality, creating the illusion that she was descending through a tunnel of captured starlight. At the base of the staircase, Isadora emerged into a vast antechamber that served as the heart of Mortimer's underground creation. The space was circular, with a domed ceiling that rose to a height of nearly 20 feet, supported by columns that had been carved to resemble the trunks of ancient trees. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with each column featuring bark-like textures and branch patterns that seemed to grow organically from the stone floor to the curved ceiling above. The chamber was illuminated not by gas fixtures, as she had expected, but by an ingenious system of mirrors and reflective surfaces that channeled natural light from sources that remained invisible to her observation. The light possessed a quality that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight, neither fully bright nor completely dim, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between day and night. This illumination system explained the fresh air that had greeted her during her descent, suggesting that Mortimer had designed ventilation and lighting solutions that connected to the surface world through concealed channels. 6 passages radiated outward from the central chamber, each marked with brass plaques that bore inscriptions in Latin. The passages were designated as Bibliotheca Perpetua, Camera Memoriae, Sanctum Familiae, Repositorium Vitae, Atrium Temporis, and Cubiculum Ultimum. Each designation suggested a specific purpose, though the exact nature of these functions remained unclear from the inscriptions alone. Isadora chose to explore the passage marked Bibliotheca Perpetua first, drawn by the familiar comfort that libraries had always provided her. The corridor extended for approximately 50 feet before opening into a chamber that took her breath away. The room was a perfect replica of the mansion's library, but expanded to 3 times its size and filled with volumes that seemed to represent the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The books themselves were arranged with meticulous care, organized according to systems that went far beyond simple alphabetical or chronological ordering. Sections were devoted to family genealogies that traced the Vale lineage back through generations that predated any records she had seen in the mansion above. Other areas contained detailed documentation of agricultural techniques, architectural plans for structures that had never been built, and scientific treatises on subjects that seemed decades ahead of contemporary understanding. Most remarkable were the volumes that appeared to be ongoing chronicles of the Vale family's daily activities, written in multiple hands and extending up to dates that were disturbingly recent. These records contained intimate details about family members, lives, thoughts, and activities that could only have been documented by someone with constant access to the mansion's most private spaces. The implications of such comprehensive surveillance created a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber's temperature. The Camera Memoriae proved to be a portrait gallery that featured paintings of Vale family members spanning multiple generations. However, these were not the formal portraits that hung in the mansion's public rooms, but rather intimate studies that captured their subjects in moments of unguarded emotion. The paintings were arranged chronologically, creating a visual timeline that revealed subtle changes in the family's appearance and demeanor across the decades. What disturbed Isadora most profoundly was the discovery of portraits depicting family members who had supposedly died years or even decades earlier, yet were shown in settings and clothing that suggested much more recent creation. Her own grandfather, who had passed away when she was a child, was depicted in a painting that showed him as she remembered him, but wearing clothes that had not been fashionable until years after his documented death. The Sanctum Familiae contained what appeared to be living quarters designed for extended habitation. Multiple bedrooms, each furnished with personal belongings that belonged to various family members, suggested that the underground structure had been intended to house the entire Vale lineage simultaneously. The rooms were maintained in perfect condition, with fresh linens, recently lit candles, and personal effects arranged as if their occupants had stepped away only moments before. The preservation of these spaces defied logical explanation, as did the presence of fresh flowers in vases throughout the chambers. Someone or something had been maintaining these rooms with meticulous care, ensuring that they remained ready for immediate occupancy despite the apparent absence of any inhabitants. The Repositorium Vitae, revealed itself to be the most unsettling chamber Isadora had yet encountered in her exploration of the underground structure. The room stretched beyond the reach of her lamplight, filled with countless glass cases that contained what appeared to be personal effects, clothing, and mementos from every generation of the Vale family. Each case was meticulously labeled with dates, names, and detailed descriptions written in the same precise handwriting that had characterized Mortimer's architectural notes. The collection was comprehensive to a degree that bordered on the obsessive. Items that Isadora remembered losing as a child were displayed alongside belongings that had supposedly been buried with deceased family members. Her grandmother's wedding dress, which she had been told was interred with the woman upon her death, hung in pristine condition within a climate-controlled case. Her father's favorite pipe, which had disappeared shortly after his funeral, rested on velvet cushioning with a placard indicating the exact date and time of its acquisition. Most disturbing were the cases that contained items from her own recent daily life. A handkerchief she had misplaced the previous week, a book she had been reading and thought she had left in her bedroom, and even a letter she had written but decided not to send were all present in the collection. The implications suggested a level of surveillance and access to the mansion's private spaces that defied rational explanation. The atrium temporis proved to be a chamber dedicated to the documentation of time itself within the underground realm. Elaborate clockwork mechanisms lined the walls, each designed to track different aspects of temporal passage. Some clocks measured conventional hours and days, while others seemed calibrated to track longer cycles that spanned months, years, and even decades. The largest mechanism, positioned at the chamber's center, appeared to be counting towards some future date that was inscribed in brass numerals, December 21st, 1899. The clockwork devices were accompanied by detailed charts and graphs that tracked various environmental conditions within the underground structure. Temperature, humidity, air pressure, and other atmospheric measurements had been recorded with scientific precision over what appeared to be decades of continuous observation. The data suggested that someone had been maintaining these records with unwavering dedication, documenting every fluctuation in the underground environment's conditions. Adjacent to the temporal measurements were genealogical charts that traced the Vale family lineage with extraordinary detail. These records went far beyond conventional family trees, documenting not only births, deaths, and marriages, but also detailed physical descriptions, personality traits, and what were described as hereditary obligations. The chart suggested that each generation of the Vale family had been expected to fulfill specific roles within some larger design that remained unclear from the documentation alone. The cubiculum ultimum was the final chamber Isadora explored, and it proved to be the most elaborate of all the underground rooms. The space was designed as a grand hall that rivaled the mansion's great room in both size and ornamentation. However, where the mansion's public spaces were designed to impress visitors, this chamber seemed intended for ceremonies or gatherings of a more private and significant nature. The hall was dominated by a massive table carved from a single piece of ebony, surrounded by chairs that bore the carved initials of various Vale family members spanning multiple generations. Each chair was positioned with mathematical precision, suggesting that specific seating arrangements held importance for whatever activities had taken place within the chamber. The table's surface was inlaid with intricate patterns that seemed to map the underground structure's layout, creating a three-dimensional representation of the entire complex. At the far end of the hall stood an ornate cabinet that contained what appeared to be ceremonial objects and documents. Robes made from rich fabrics, ceremonial cups crafted from precious metals, and bound volumes that seemed to contain instructions or protocols for activities that were never explicitly described. The object suggested rituals or ceremonies that had been conducted within the chamber, though their exact nature remained mysterious. Most significant was the discovery of a guest registry that documented visits to the underground chambers spanning several decades. The entries were signed by various Vale family members, but the dates of their visits often occurred years after their documented deaths in the world above. The registry suggested that the underground structure had continued to host family gatherings long after the participants should have been unable to attend such events. The final entry in the registry was dated only 3 weeks prior to Isadora's discovery, signed with her father's distinctive handwriting despite his death the previous spring. The entry simply read, "Preparations complete. The family awaits the final gathering." The revelation contained within the guest registry sent Isadora retreating from the underground chambers with a haste that bordered on panic. Her ascent up the spiral staircase felt interminable, each step echoing through the stone passages like a heartbeat that belonged to the structure itself. When she finally emerged into the familiar surroundings of the Great Hall, the rotating fireplace sealed itself behind her with the same mechanical precision that had revealed it, leaving no trace of the passage she had just traversed. The mansion above ground now felt fundamentally altered by her knowledge of what lay beneath. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the corridors, and every shadow that moved in her peripheral vision carried new significance. The house that had been her sanctuary for 4 decades had become a stage where she was both performer and audience, watched by eyes she could not see and judged by standards she did not understand. Sleep became elusive in the nights following her discovery. Isadora found herself lying awake, listening to sounds that had always been present, but which she now interpreted through the lens of her new knowledge. Footsteps that she had previously attributed to the settling of old wood now seemed to follow deliberate patterns, moving through the mansion according to routes that corresponded to the hidden passages Mortimer had documented in his architectural plans. The household staff, who had served the Vale family for generations, began to exhibit behaviors that Isadora had never noticed before. Their movements through the mansion followed precise schedules that seemed designed to avoid certain areas at specific times. Conversations ceased abruptly when she entered rooms, and she frequently caught glimpses of knowing looks exchanged between servants who had previously seemed to share nothing more than professional courtesy. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had managed the estate since Isadora's childhood, displayed the most pronounced changes in behavior. The woman who had once been a source of comfort and stability now moved through the mansion with an air of purpose that suggested responsibilities extending far beyond conventional domestic duties. She carried keys that Isadora had never seen before, accessed rooms that were supposedly unused, and maintained areas of the house that should have shown signs of neglect, given their apparent abandonment. The realization that her entire household staff might be complicit in maintaining the underground structure's secrets created a sense of isolation that penetrated every aspect of Isadora's daily existence. Meals were prepared and served with the same efficiency as always, but she now questioned whether the food itself might be part of some larger design. Her clothing was cleaned and pressed with meticulous care, but she wondered whether her garments were being examined for evidence of her underground explorations. Most unsettling were the subtle changes in the mansion's physical environment that became apparent once Isadora knew what to observe. Rooms that had been cold for years suddenly maintained comfortable temperatures despite the absence of any visible heating sources. Areas of the house that had suffered from persistent dampness were now perfectly dry, suggesting that the underground structure's environmental controls extended throughout the entire building. The library, which had always been Isadora's refuge, now felt like a carefully curated collection designed to guide her thoughts in specific directions. Books that she remembered reading contained passages that seemed different from her recollections. while volumes she had never seen before appeared on shelves that had previously held familiar titles. The changes were subtle enough to be attributed to faulty memory, but their cumulative effect created a sense that even her most private thoughts were being influenced by unseen hands. Correspondence that had once arrived with predictable regularity began to follow patterns that seemed designed to isolate her from the outside world. Letters from friends and business associates contained subtle discouragement from visiting the estate, while invitations to social gatherings mysteriously failed to reach her until after the events had concluded. The isolation was gradual enough to seem natural, but comprehensive enough to ensure that she remained within the sphere of influence that the underground structure represented. The mansion's mirrors began to reflect images that lingered just beyond the edge of clear perception. Shadows that moved independently of their supposed sources, figures that appeared in reflective surfaces when no one should have been present, and glimpses of faces that belonged to family members who had been dead for decades. These apparitions never remained long enough to be examined closely, but their frequency increased as Isadora's knowledge of the underground structure deepened. Windows that had once provided clear views of the estate's grounds now seemed to filter the outside world through a lens that made familiar landscapes appear foreign and threatening. The gardens that had been her father's pride showed signs of cultivation that she had not authorized, with plants arranged in patterns that seemed to correspond to the geometric designs she had observed in the underground chambers. The boundary between the world above and the realm below had begun to dissolve, creating a reality where the mansion existed as a bridge between two different forms of existence. Isadora found herself questioning not only the nature of her family's legacy, but the fundamental assumptions about life and death that had governed her understanding of the world. The underground structure was not merely a hidden foundation beneath her home, but a parallel existence that had been operating according to its own rules for generations. The winter solstice of 1892 approached with an inevitability that seemed to permeate every aspect of the Vale estate. The date that Isadora had observed inscribed on the great clockwork mechanism in the underground chambers drew near with each passing day, and the mansion above ground began to exhibit changes that defied rational explanation. The very atmosphere of the house seemed to thicken, as if the boundary between the visible world and the hidden realm below was gradually dissolving. Isadora's attempts to maintain her normal routines became increasingly futile as the estate itself seemed to resist any pretense of ordinary existence. Doors that had always opened easily now required considerable effort to move, as if the house were reluctant to allow passage between its rooms. Staircases that had been climbed thousands of times throughout her life now seemed to lead to destinations that were subtly different from her expectations, with familiar rooms appearing altered in ways that were difficult to define but impossible to ignore. The household staff had abandoned any pretense of conventional service, moving through the mansion with purposes that clearly extended beyond domestic maintenance. They carried implements and materials that bore no resemblance to typical cleaning supplies, and their activities followed schedules that seemed coordinated with celestial events rather than practical necessity. Mrs. Hartwell had taken to wearing clothing that appeared to be ceremonial in nature, with fabrics and designs that suggested traditions far older than the mansion itself. The underground chambers had begun to exert an influence that extended throughout the entire structure. Sounds that originated in the hidden realm below could be heard clearly in the mansion's upper floors, creating an acoustic connection that made privacy impossible. Scents that belonged to the preserved chambers below wafted through the mansion's corridors, carrying with them the suggestion of occupancy and activity in spaces that should have been empty. Most disturbing was the gradual appearance of family members who had been dead for years, decades, or even generations. These figures moved through the mansion with the familiarity of long-term residents, occupying spaces and following routines that suggested they had never truly departed. They appeared most clearly in peripheral vision, becoming translucent or disappearing entirely when observed directly, but their presence was undeniable and increasingly frequent. Isadora's grandfather, whose portrait she had discovered in the underground gallery, began to appear in his former study with such regularity that she found herself avoiding that wing of the mansion entirely. Her grandmother could be glimpsed tending to gardens that had been neglected for decades, working with plants that bloomed out of season and in defiance of the harsh winter weather. Even more distant ancestors, known to her only through family portraits and genealogical records, had begun to manifest throughout the estate. The convergence of past and present created a temporal confusion that made it difficult to distinguish between memory and immediate experience. Conversations that had taken place years earlier seemed to echo through the mansion's corridors, while events that belonged to family history appeared to be unfolding in real time. The house had become a repository of accumulated moments, where every significant event in the Vale family's history continued to exist simultaneously. The mechanical systems that Mortimer had installed throughout the underground structure had begun to operate with increasing frequency and intensity. The sound of clockwork mechanisms could be heard throughout the mansion, marking time according to calculations that bore no relationship to conventional chronology. Ventilation systems circulated air that carried voices from the chambers below, creating an auditory connection between the two levels of existence that the estate represented. Isadora found herself drawn repeatedly to the Great Hall, where the hidden entrance to the underground realm beckoned with an urgency that grew stronger each day. The carved figures on the mantelpiece seemed to move when she was not looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into positions that suggested invitation rather than mere decoration. The mechanism that controlled access to the chambers below had begun to activate spontaneously, revealing the passage without any manipulation of the carved elements. The isolation that had characterized her existence since discovering the underground structure was gradually being replaced by a sense of crowding, as if the mansion were filling with occupants who existed just beyond the threshold of normal perception. The estate that had once felt too large for a single inhabitant now seemed barely adequate to contain the multitude of presences that had taken up residence within its walls. As December 21st approached, the distinction between the world above and the realm below continued to erode, creating a reality where past and present, living and dead, visible and hidden, existed in a state of perpetual convergence that defied every assumption about the nature of existence itself. December 21st, 1892, arrived with a silence that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the Vale estate. The winter solstice brought with it an atmospheric pressure that made breathing difficult and movement laborious, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath in anticipation of some momentous event. Isadora found herself drawn inexorably toward the Great Hall, where the hidden entrance stood open without any activation of Mortimer's ingenious mechanism. The underground chambers had transformed since her last visit, filled now with a warm, golden light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, rather than any visible source. The spiral staircase descended into an environment that pulsed with life and activity, where the preservation systems that had maintained the hidden realm for decades had reached their ultimate purpose. The air carried the scents of fresh flowers, burning candles, and the subtle fragrances that belonged to family members she had not encountered in years. The central chamber had been prepared for a gathering of unprecedented scale. The circular space now accommodated dozens of figures who moved with the grace and purpose of long-anticipated reunion. Every generation of the Vale family was represented, from the most distant ancestors whose names existed only in genealogical records to relatives who had passed away in recent years. They appeared solid and substantial, no longer the peripheral shadows that had haunted the mansion's corridors, but fully realized presences who welcomed Isadora with expressions of profound relief and satisfaction. Her father stood near the center of the assembly, appearing exactly as she remembered him, but radiating a vitality that transcended his earthly existence. Her grandparents, great-grandparents, and ancestors stretching back through centuries of family history had gathered to witness what they clearly considered the culmination of a design that had been generations in the making. The underground structure had not been built as a tomb or a hiding place, but as a sanctuary where the Vale family could continue to exist beyond the constraints of conventional mortality. The clockwork mechanisms that had counted down to this moment now chimed in perfect harmony, marking not the end of something, but the beginning of a new phase of existence that would allow the family to persist indefinitely within the protected environment that Mortimer had created. The chambers that had seemed empty during her earlier explorations now revealed their true purpose as living spaces designed to accommodate the eternal residence of everyone who carried the Vale name. Isadora understood with crystalline clarity that she had been the final piece in a puzzle that had been assembled across multiple generations. Her discovery of the underground realm, her exploration of its chambers, and her gradual acceptance of its reality had completed the process that would allow her to join the family gathering that had been waiting for her arrival. The isolation she had experienced in recent months had been preparation for a reunion that would last forever. The boundary between life and death, between past and present, between the visible world and the hidden realm, dissolved completely as Isadora took her place among the assembled generations of her family. The Vale estate would continue to exist above ground, maintained by forces that operated beyond conventional understanding, while the true heart of the family legacy flourished in the chambers that Mortimer had designed to preserve their essence for eternity. The mansion stood empty in the winter twilight, its windows dark and its corridors silent, waiting for the next generation to discover the secrets that lay beneath its floors. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.